Es un placer estar hoy día con todos ustedes. I am Maria Rosa Vaquerizo. I'm the Executive President of the Peruvian American Association. And also I'm the CEO of the Andean Group, the Andean American Associations. Welcome to today's program, Peru Getting Through the Crisis, an economic, political, and social outlook. We are very honored to have with us today a great group of panelists, Dr. Julio Carrion, Dr. Paulo Mateus, and Dr. Cynthia Sanborn. And as a moderator, we have John Quigley from Bloomberg News. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Few words about the Peruvian American Association. It was founded in 1938. The Peruvian American Association is part of the Andean American Association, and it was the first chamber of commerce founded in the US for Peru. We are a non-for-profit organization, and we provide a forum for all the leaders that are shaping today's Peru. We thank you for joining us from many countries and for this, and to be interested in this event that will pinpoint the current situation of Peru. We're pleased to welcome Ambassador Maria Landaveri. She's the Consul General in New York, and also Bernardo Muñoz, who is the Director of Prom Peru in New York, who are both with us today. Our moderator, John Quigley, studied journalism in London and Latin American studies from London Metropolitan University. He was a reporter on the commodity markets for important British trade publications. He covers Peru's economic, financial markets, and politics for Bloomberg News. And now I will turn the program over to John, and he will guide the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Rosa, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the association for organizing this very timely event. And well, allow me to introduce this distinguished panel to put the extraordinary events of the last week into a broader context. Paulo Mateus is Vice President in the Latin America Economic Research Team at Goldman Sachs. He's responsible for macro coverage of Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Prior to joining the firm, Paulo was a strategist in emerging markets at Barclays Capital, and previously an economist at HSBC and a fixed income strategist at Itaú Securities. Cynthia Sanborn is a professor of political science at the Universidad de Pacífico in Lima, where she's held posts including Vice President of Research. Cynthia has also chaired the board of the Peruvian Consortium for Economic and Social Research and has been a visiting professor at Harvard. She's written and edited publications related to Peruvian and international politics and development, including work on the social and political impact of Chinese investment in Peru. Finally, Julio Carrion is Associate Professor and Associate Chair at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware, where he was founder and director of the Center for Global and Area Studies. His publications have covered issues of democracy, authoritarianism, and populism, especially in Peru, but also in the Andean region and the Americas. So with that, I will give the floor to Paulo for our first presentation. Paulo.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for the association for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Clearly, as John said, this has been a very timely event. And now, before we start, I would like to just share a few slides with you so I can go over briefly what's happened to the economy in recent months since the beginning of the pandemic, and the virus situation as well, that, as you all know, has been quite quite dramatic in Peru. Right, so hopefully you can see my screen now, the slides. So just going briefly on the virus situation. And I think what we've been seeing in Peru is a country that unfortunately has gotten the worst of both worlds, right? So on the virus front, we have, when compared to all other major economies in the world, the largest countries in the world, you can see that Peru, on a per capita basis, has one of the highest contagion rates, just in our region, just behind Chile, but still ahead of Brazil, ahead of the US, and ahead of all the other European countries that were affected quite severely at the start of this pandemic. And on the fatalities, the numbers are even worse, right? So Peru now has the most fatalities on a per capita basis, even ahead of countries like Spain and Chile that had, again, a pretty dire situation. Right? And the evolution of the virus and the contagion in Peru was even more surprising given the measures that the government implemented. This that I'm showing you right now is our effective lockdown index. It's basically a combination of University of Oxford index that tracks official measures to official quarantine measures and mobility indicators from Google. So the higher this index, the stricter the measures, the quarantine in each country. So as you can see on the red line here, Peru has had one of the strictest lockdowns in the region throughout this whole pandemic, right? So since the very beginning, Peru was one of the first countries to really tighten measures of mobility. And basically, after the second wave, the second contagion that we started to see at the end of July and beginning of August, those measures ramped up again. The government postponed some measures to reopen the economy, and mobility was again affected negatively. Right? So clearly we had a very forceful response by the government. And despite that response, we had the very bad numbers that you just saw in the first two charts that I just showed you. As a result, if we look at what's happened to activity and looking specifically at real GDP growth in the second quarter, the picture is quite starking, right? So compared to all the other countries that we cover here at Goldman Sachs, Peru has had the deepest contraction of all, with a 30% contraction in real GDP. So of course, quite significant, and we already had seen the first effects on the economy already in March. Right, so the economy started slowing down in March, but then in the second quarter, the period through April, from April through June, that's where we saw the biggest hit to activity. Right. So as besides the measures to reduce mobility and to keep people at home with the curfews and all the other measures, the government has implemented a very strong fiscal and monetary response. Right, so the central bank has cut the policy rate to its effective lower bound, just 25 basis points, and has kept it there for quite some time, and has offered subsidized loans through Reactiva Peru from the first and second stage of that program, which has helped to reduce lending rates across the board. And also the fiscal response has been quite significant as well. If you see here on this chart, the fiscal response alone, which is the dark blue bars there, was pretty high to the tune of around 9% of GDP. So the other measures that I mentioned were another 9% of GDP. So we're talking about something between 15 and 20% of GDP, which is by far the largest response that we've seen from the largest emerging markets. And it rivals even other developed economies around the globe. So it's quite startling to see how it's actually a paradox. If you try to understand how can a country that basically did everything right, so with the quarantine measures to try to contain the virus, and with a very forceful fiscal and monetary response to contain the economic damage, even then ended up with one of the worst pictures on the contagion and one of the worst contractions in economic activity. So it's quite starky to see that combination, given the policy response that we've had, right? So maybe today we can look back and say, okay, maybe the government should not have acted the way it did. Maybe the quarantine was too strict. However, as they say, hindsight is always smarter than foresight. So standing today is a lot easier to say and to look back on those things. But even today, it's not clear that the response should be any different. Right, so we don't know if the government had not taken the steps that it took. Maybe the situation on the virus front would be even worse. Right, so it's clearly a very delicate situation on the economic side, with, of course, very dire consequences for the social side as well. Right, and then we'll touch a little bit more on that later with my other colleagues as well. Now, looking forward, given the size, the magnitude of the contraction that we've had in the second quarter, we should have, for the whole year, for 2020, one of the deepest contractions around the globe. Right? The economy has already started to recover. We've seen sequential growth in activity starting already in May. And the recovery has been quite fast. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a V-shaped recovery, because a V-shape, when you say V, it gives the idea that the downside is equally steep as the upside, which won't be the case in Peru. We expect a less steep recovery, and we see real GDP only recovering the levels before the crisis started in February. Only by 2022, right? So we won't. There will be a long recovery process ahead of us, and that is already incorporating all the massive fiscal and monetary response that the policymakers have pursued. Now, looking ahead, of course, Peru is still one of the countries with the highest growth potential in the region, right? So the fact that we're having such a deep contraction in 2020 also sets the stage for a strong recovery in going into next year. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty of how the recovery could take shape. There's a lot of uncertainty on the political dynamics, and Julio will touch on this, that might affect the recovery as well. But today, given what we have, the information that we have today, we should see Peru recovering quite sharply next year. Again, this won't be enough to fully recover the lost product that we've had since March. That should only take place at some point in the middle of 2022. But certainly, we should see a fairly strong recovery going into next year. And that's pretty much it of the broad picture. I'll leave more details for our discussion later on. So now I'll give back the floor to John. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Paulo. Yeah, our next speaker is Cynthia, so I'll hand over to you.
Okay, that's pretty heavy stuff to follow. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this, and thank you very much to the Peruvian and Andean American associations for allowing us to join you from Lima and from 6 months of lockdown. Paulo said that Peru may have done everything right this time in responding to the pandemic. And that may well be true. I think I'm going to try to address maybe what we might not have done right beforehand, or a piece of it. I'd like to talk about the role of natural resource extraction in Peruvian society, and particularly in the context of economic recovery. I've been doing a lot of research about the role of mining in society and the role of mining in our economy, and also the presence of Chinese investment in the sector. As many of you know very well, the Peruvian economy has a significant dependence on mining and mineral exports. We're among the world's leaders in copper, gold, silver, iron, and we also share with our neighbors now holding quite a bit of contested lithium reserves. Large-scale mining represents about 10% of that GDP that we saw, over 60% of exports, something like 20% of tax revenues. And for this reason, the National Mining Society will say that it is a motor, if not the motor, for economic reactivation. In fact, one of the leaders of the Mining Society the other day said, mining reflects the state of health of the Peruvian economy. And if that's the case, this is a very important and problematic sector. I would add that China is the major market for all the minerals that we export, for a lot of what we export, as with much of the region. 62% of our copper goes to China. And Peru supplies around 27% of China's copper needs. So we also have to keep a very close eye on what is happening on the Chinese side and what it means for us. Chinese firms represent around a quarter of the total copper production of Peru and almost a third of our total mining portfolio. So we're very much linked in that sense. While mining has a very significant presence in our economy and in our society, and in those numbers that Paulo shared with us, these activities also have significant social and environmental impact and have been the leading cause and sector around which social conflict has persisted in our society in recent years. And social conflict around mining and around its impacts has been one of the factors leading to the decline in new investment, not now, but in the last couple of years, well before the pandemic. The benefits of large-scale mining, both direct and through tax revenues, are seen to accrue to very few and at a distance, whereas the amount of changes that happen at a local level when a mining project gets underway can be very disruptive to local communities and exacerbate inequalities and tensions that may already be there. Peru in recent years has made considerable progress in what I would call measures of natural resource governance. Peru has actually stood out. This is another paradox of this country. Peru has stood out in the region for raising standards on formal sector extractive activity, from open bidding for contracts to the right to prior consultation of indigenous communities, ILO 169 being implemented, to environmental impact assessments that are very serious and rigorous and demanding, to putting measures on local content, on percentage of imported labor, labor rights in the mining sector, monitoring and preventing environmental impact, as well as measures of redistribution of the tax revenues. Peru has this mining canon in which half of the revenues generated by this activity go to regional and sub-regional government. We also have transparency measures. Peru is the first country in Latin America to join the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and to get all the major companies involved in publishing what they pay and making more transparent their activities, including the Chinese companies that don't do it in China. They don't meet these standards in China, but in Peru, they've all been held to pretty high standards. And although companies have complained a lot about some of the safeguards and measures and the delays that some of these governance measures imply, for the most part, companies have been learning to deal with them and learning to implement them and give more attention to community relations. So I think Peru is making progress in this sector, not without difficulty because of the conflict that it generates. But what happens when the pandemic hits? And as we can imagine from what Paulo presented beforehand at a more macro level, those first 3.5 months of mandatory quarantine, the mineral production declined significantly, 20 to 36% depending on the mineral. And mining exports contracted by more than 50%. The majority of operations and the majority of companies were either suspended, just a minimum of activities were maintained. 75% of mine workers and mining personnel had to be evacuated from mine sites and moved to other places. Our hotels, while empty for tourism, are full of workers in these companies who have to be moved back and forth from site. There's a huge amount of investment and mobilization of people in a short amount of time. Since June, reactivation has been taking place, and mining has been a priority sector for the government in terms of reactivating and authorizing new activity. And mining has been cited as critical by government, by the private sector, of course, and in surveys, over 80% of the Peruvian population would also say that the mining sector is fundamental to reactivate. It has a lot of advantages to getting it back online. And despite the pandemic, the Ministry of Energy and Mines is still talking about a portfolio of several billion in new investment to be expected. The Mining Society is saying that the copper production levels are resuming similar to where they were last year. Gold is still not, but we still expect a significant decline at the end of the year in terms of production. And the tax revenues from this activity, therefore, are also pretty significant, and what that means at the local level in terms of mining canon are so as well. But what happens at the societal level? We all are forced into this lockdown, which, as Paulo mentioned, was one of the most dramatic in the region. But perhaps not surprisingly, older conflicts, when the reactivation starts to take place, older social conflicts that have remained and resume in Cusco and Ancash. We've seen significant resumption of conflicts around issues that have been in place for some time, and new ones have been added to the list. Last month, the Defensoría del Pueblo reported 192 social conflicts in the country, of which the majority were social environmental, and around 65% of them related to the mining sector. They also reported hundreds of protests, and a significant number of those protests were now labor related. Mine workers related to the incidents or the inability to control COVID-19 on mine sites, which was a big problem, or worried about collective or individual layoffs. It's been extremely difficult in practice, and I've been talking to mining executives and others in the sector, extremely difficult to apply protocols. You have to mobilize the numbers of workers, you have to mobilize the remote locations of mining camps, the difficulty of maintaining social distance in a mining camp. It's just been extremely challenging, and add to that the supply chain problems, both things coming from overseas and within moving around the country. It's been extremely difficult. Perhaps most affected have been the construction of new mines. There was a lot of expectation for Quellaveco, for example, and others to come online. But building a mine requires the kind of thousands of people on site that it's very difficult still to manage. So that's been held up quite a bit. And the conflicts, if we look at the conflicts that have been raised, there's conflicts around transportation, conflicts around benefits, but also a number of them stem from the government. And this will go back to Paulo saying, not doing things right in the past. Many things stem from government not coming through on its commitments, and the high turnover that we have in the public sector that Julio may speak to as well, means that you have negotiations, you have mesas de diálogo, you make a series of agreements, and then everybody changes in the government and nobody remembers what was agreed, and people go back to protesting the company or holding up the road because nobody else is listening. And quite a few of the conflicts we're seeing now are related to different actors not complying with what they agreed to the last time around. If we add to this the inability of many regional and local governments to spend the tax revenues that they have from mining. And I was looking at the other day, it's not just spending it badly. There's quite a bit of corruption and quite a bit of poor spending, but also not spending. Around 35% of the tax revenues that are redistributed to needy regions from mining is simply not spent at all. And this means that people come back to companies when they have needs because they don't see the money being invested locally. And this has been especially dramatic in the context of the pandemic. We see around the country hospitals that were contracted but never built or never completed in time, and now we need them. We see insufficient numbers of trained doctors and nurses. We see the lack of emergency rooms with ventilators and oxygen. And we see companies having to pitch in aside from the tax revenues that they have turned over that have not been spent, companies having to pitch in with mobilizing oxygen, with mobilizing ventilators, with getting basic supplies to people in need, and moving in many cases faster than the government has been able to move. Moving forward, I think that one of the things we're seeing from this is that the extraction of non-renewable natural resources, particularly minerals, continues to be seen as the motor or the expectation for this economy by government, by many in the private sector and otherwise. But I think we need very significant rethinking about how we do it, and if we can achieve more inclusive and more socially environmentally responsible mining, as well as more linkages between this sector and others, the ability to generate more employment, the ability to use cleaner technologies, and the ability to manage the amount of the kind of workforce and the kind of impacts we have with the pandemic on top of it now. Because although we're getting good news about the vaccine and Peru is participating directly in the clinical trials for vaccines, it's going to take quite a while before we can go back to what might be normal in these kind of activities. In terms of social conflict, the Minister of Energy and Mines, the one who I think is still there, but Julio will tell us how long he's going to stay. He's been implicated in other recent political things. But Minister Anchaustegui has said that the government is committed to only moving forward on those projects that enjoy social acceptance. And therefore, big ones like Conga in the north or like Tia Maria in Arequipa are not on the table. But it's not clear of the list of ones that are still on the table how hard it's going to be or how easy it's going to be to move forward in terms of the kind of social challenges they're facing as well. The government faces a lot of pressures to ease up on restrictions and also to accelerate exploration, to accelerate and bypass things that are seen as overregulation, to reform the mining canon procedures and help the government spend better. But I think there's some fear that this pressure is going to lead to lowering the bar or rolling back resource governance measures that personally I think Peru had made considerable progress on. For example, there's pressures to bypass the prior consultation process. Peru has committed to implementing the rights of indigenous communities to be consulted about activities in their territories. But there's a lot of pressure to bypass that, especially with the difficulties of carrying out consultation in the context of social distancing. Consultation is not applied in concessions, but it has been contested and trying to apply in exploration and extraction. There's some concern to facilitate more quickly rights to exploration, but sometimes bypassing again the kind of consultation that needs to be done before exploration companies show up in people's backyards and communities, to increase production levels and move transportation more, although the impacts of transportation around the clock in some places like Las Bambas has been a significant source of conflict. And there's labor issues that are also on the table. There's a lot of subcontracting in this industry and concerns that that's going to continue. So I would just say that there's unresolved challenges from pre-pandemic in terms of making compatible a mining dependent economy with more social inclusion and more environmental and socially responsible activities and measures. And now we face a pressure to lower the bar in the process of reactivation that I think is not incompatible. I think we can continue to maintain high standards in this industry and do better in terms of reducing the conflict. But part of that is based on the politics of it and what's happening at the public sector. And I think Julio is going to give us the good or bad news on that front. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Julio, on the political miasma.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Okay, I think I can do it. Okay, so we are on the brink of the removal of a president or not. And that's basically the situation of Peruvian politics today, right? We were planning this meeting last week, and then all of a sudden, my presentation that was supposed to basically just talk about the possible scenario of the elections in April of next year, turned out completely different because, you know, this issue of the presidential impeachment fell on our lap. And as we speak, just a few hours ago, the Constitutional Tribunal ruled against an injunction that Vizcarra requested so that he wouldn't have to show up tomorrow in Congress to respond the accusations that he faces. We don't know as of right now what is going to happen tomorrow. Vizcarra has said initially that he doesn't want to show up, but many political actors are telling him that even if there are no votes for his removal, it will be a good idea that he shows up to give a little bit, but we don't know. And so instead of really getting into the nitty-gritty of what may happen, what were the reasons that we are hearing yet again another impeachment process in Peru, I wanted to sort of have a more bird's eye perspective on the current political crisis, which I call the perfect storm, because it's a combination really of three factors. Some that are built in to the political institutions, and some that just are more conjunctural, they just happen to be. But I think it will be useful to sort of reflect a little bit about how this combination of factors have taken us to this moment, which had significant consequences, right? I mean, the situation that both Paulo and Cynthia described can be explained in certain way by the inability of the political system to deliver what is expected of a political system. So let me start by identifying these three factors that I think explain the situation of political crisis in Peru today. First of all, the flaws in institutional design. We are still operating under the 1993 constitution that Alberto Fujimori basically wrote to facilitate his autocratic form of government. And a significant component of that was, of course, the elimination of the Senate. So Peru moved from a traditional two-chamber congressional parliamentary regime to a unicameral system, which I think it has significant consequences for the way in which Congress and the president interact, but also about it has significant consequences for the way the actors' political calculations are established. This unicameral system and the perversive incentive of this unicameral system was, in my view, worsened by the recent constitutional reform that eliminated congressional re-election. And even though this proviso of the constitutional, of the banning of congressional re-election was not applied to those Congress people that were elected in 2016, it is in place supposedly for those who are in Congress today. It's still a little unclear. It's not completely sure that the banning of re-election will apply to those who are sitting in Congress right now, but the issue has not been ruled on by the Constitutional Tribunal nor by the Electoral Board. And this is very important because a significant consequence of not having congressional re-election is that it shortens the time horizons of political actors and erases the possibility of engaging in the kind of egotistical behavior seeking short-term gains rather than medium or long-term gains. And if we add to that the vagueness of this constitutional clause that establishes that one of the reasons of why a president can be removed is the permanent moral incapacity, we have a situation where a president can be removed in a matter of days with no more than a vote or two in a unicameral Congress. No constitutional committee, no committee in charge of charging the presidents, no accusation in the lower chamber that then will be voted on in the upper chamber, which is the case in the United States. there are no checks built into the system, and that can lead to a vacancy express, which seems to be one of the trending terms in Twitter in Peru today. If we add to that the nature of the current of the party system, which, to put it briefly, there is no party system in Peru, right? So the all ideological or political representations of parties are no longer effective organizations. Some congressional representations with significant power today are nothing more than extension of business interests. They are doing business by political means, especially those who are attached to the industry of the for-profit universities. And so they want to make sure that as the Peruvian state tries to control the quality of these institutions, that their economic business will not be affected. And then we have some congressional representations that can only be described as disloyal or at best semi-disloyal opposition to the democratic system. They are they have a different political projects which are represented by somebody who I'm going to speak about in a minute. And they are there to basically blow up the system. They are not loyal democratic oppositions. And then we have the set of political circumstances in which we have a president with no congressional representation or party. Now, why is this bad? Well, it's bad because the recent revelations of the audio tapes show a president that is highly isolated from other political representations. Somebody who relies exclusively on a very narrow set of advisors, of people that he knows from 10, 15 years ago, since the time that he was a regional president or regional governor today. That's the name that we use. And so he doesn't really have the ability or the capability to reach out to political representations in Congress. He does not play politics the way a president should play, especially when that person lacks a political party. And as I said, because Congress people have faced this uncertainty whether they can be reelected or not, many of them are just trying to extend their mandate. It is not an accident that Vizcarra said that a couple of political parties approached him demanding that he postpone the elections. Probably this effort at impeachment was another way of trying to postpone the elections, because of course, if the elections are postponed, they will stay in their positions a little longer. So that combination has created this perfect storm, as I call it. My general concerns with with the political situation in Peru right now can be my main concern is institutional decay. The current Congress has to select a new constitutional tribunal, and I am afraid that that is going to be a situation where many interests will try to defend their position by negotiating with some characters that should not be sitting in a constitutional tribunal. And then the general issues of oversized presidential powers. The Peruvian constitution already gave significant powers to the president. And in the last confrontation that Vizcarra had with the Fujimoristas, he gained some additional powers, especially because the Congress that he dissolved was so unpopular, and many people were willing to give those powers to the president because he was on the right side of the issue. But the problem is that Vizcarra is not going to be president forever. And so those powers that he gained might be utilized next for somebody who shouldn't have them. Okay, the second part of my presentation briefly has to do with the elections scheduled for April of 2021. So what are the polls telling us today? First of all, let's start by saying that for Peruvian elections, September, when the elections are in April of next year, is way, way too early. It would be even way too early if we were having this conversation 6 weeks before the election day. Peruvian elections are extremely unpredictable, and we really don't know what is going to happen until they actually happen. What is important to say in terms of the elections, what we know is that probably they are not going to organize voters' choices the way elections were organized in 2016 and in 2011. In those two last presidential elections, the main issue of contention was whether you were in favor of Fujimori or against Fujimori. It was the Fujimoristas versus anti-Fujimoristas cleavage. That sort of main cleavage, I don't think is going to be present in next year, precisely because the Fujimorista representation has lost a lot of political support. So in the absence of that organizing principle, we don't know which is the one that is going to come to replace it. Peru is very unlikely to have a competition where the debate is going to be versus left versus right. It's going to be difficult to see it as a competition between those who embrace a more institutional type of doing politics versus who's say, well, we need to be more, participatory. It is possible that it's going to turn into an election between those who wants to blow the whole system, just bring everybody down, versus those who will argue that something needs to be defended, and that is the situation where we face. The polls are telling us that the number one preference is none of the above, right? The recent polls that we have from Ipsos and IEP show that about between 40% and 50% of the people don't want any of those who are candidates today, or they really don't think that any of them deserve to be president. Then we have the mayor of the La Victoria, George Forsyth, who a former soccer player, goalkeeper, who emerges like a possible front runner. Then we have Daniel Urresti, who was a minister of Ollanta, and who is trying to capture the law and order aspect of politics without much success so far. Salvador del Solar, former prime minister, he argues, he has telling us that he doesn't want to be candidate, that he's not planning in being a candidate, but we never know, right? We never know until the deadline for registering candidacies are there. Keiko Fujimori, we don't know what is going to happen to her. She's under investigation. She was in provisional detention for a while. Now she is free. We don't know what is going to be her legal status. Veronica Mendoza, the leader of the left, is polling in 1-2%. She doesn't seem to have much of a chance. And then Julio Guzman, who could have been elected president in 2016 if he had not been removed from the ballot because of technical mistakes, is now really polling very poorly in the recent polls. And then we have the unknown. Is there anybody else who's going to be the candidato who comes from behind to be elected president? And then what I think really the big danger here is the sudden candidacy of Antauro Humala, because he has a congressional representation in Peru who is willing to create a condition so that he can be a candidate. He's currently in prison, is scheduled to be in prison until 2024. If he is released, he might be possibly legally entitled to run for the presidency. Is another unknown. But he is one of those who I would refer is a significant example of the disloyal democratic representation, right? I mean, we can talk a little bit about what his political project entitles, but it is a combination of authoritarianism, homophobia, and anti-democratic views that is quite worrisome. So I know that this is very short, and I'm making a lot of statements, but because of the time constraints, I just need to stop.
Thank you, Julio. Well, I'll try and get a forecast for the April election out of you later on. But just a reminder that you could, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, you can use the chat, and I'll read some of them later on. Just wanted to go back to Paulo. Look, to ask you about the economic outlook, because Peru was for a long time the leader in growth for Latin America, and now that's been turned on its head. But how much has the economy been set back by the pandemic? You probably had forecasts before March for Peru, which were a lot higher. Well, a lot higher than this year, obviously. But for the medium term, the government was talking about getting up to 4% growth, even 5%. How long is it going to take Peru to get back to the kind of medium-term growth rates that it was that you were expecting before the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we have a very good answer, at least in quantitative terms, right? It's very hard to have a precise forecast, and trying to incorporate all the potential long-term effects of a recession of this magnitude, right? Certainly with any recession, you have the potential for long-term consequences, right? So one of them is just people getting laid off, and the longer they are away from the labor market, the more they lose their skills, right? This is called hysteresis in the labor market. And I can actually share again just a few slides to make this point, that the impact on the labor market in Peru has been quite significant, actually even more significant than in other countries in the region. So if you look at here, this is the variation, the annual variation in the employed population. And the line for Peru is for the metropolitan region in Lima. So the employed population went down by more than 50% year over year in June, right? And when you compare to the other countries, you see a stark difference there, with others, Colombia, Mexico, Chile running around 20% decline in employment. So the hit to the labor market in Peru was particularly bad, right? Now, the question is how long this will take to recover, right? And the longer it takes, the more those people will lose skills, and the more the greater the impact on human capital and on productivity. And that is all very closely tied to potential growth, to the potential of the economy to expand. The other things that we're seeing that's happening in the labor market in Peru is a return of the informal sector. So informality has always been very high in Peru, right? So above 60% when you compare to other countries in the region that are above the average globally, well above the average. Peru really stands out. And during this crisis, we saw a very interesting dynamics. When you look at, for instance, Brazil and Chile, the informality rate actually went down. So there were more jobs lost, or at least people that left the labor market, either quitting or getting fired, or basically just losing their jobs. More people losing their jobs in the informal sector than the formal sector. So the informality rate actually went down. In Peru, was the opposite. Right, so you see an increase in informality, and there is some research that suggests changes in employment, so changes either to the formal or to the informal sector, are quite persistent over time. Right, so this can have lasting effects on the potential of the economy to recover. And we could see long-term damage to potential growth. As I mentioned in the beginning, and you also mentioned as well, Peru has always been, at least over the past 1 or 2 decades, the country in the region with the highest potential to grow. Our previous estimate before this crisis was something around 3.5% to 4%. And going back to your first question, that is what we expected in terms of growth for this year. And now we're looking at a contraction of around 14%. So that's quite a big difference. So we do have that's the most concerning aspect of this recession. We could have longer lasting effects, and that could actually damage the engines of growth, and in all the countries, of course. But in Peru, when we look at some of the metrics, particularly the labor market, the impact has been quite dramatic. The other impact that I think actually addresses one of the questions that we received, at least in some form, is increasing poverty. Right. So Peru has been able to tackle the poverty problem quite successfully. Poverty levels are still quite high compared to other countries. But when we look at where we were just 10, 15 years ago, there has been a tremendous improvement in poverty levels. Prime Minister Cateriano, who actually was very briefly there, not for long, he actually mentioned that poverty levels could increase by around 10 percentage points during this crisis. So that would set Peru back about a decade of progress on that front. And why does it matter for growth? One very obvious effect is the impact on early childhood. There's a vast academic literature on the importance of early childhood development and which has longer term consequences for potential for skill attainment and for productivity. And as people lose their jobs, as they go into poverty, you have also a lot less access to basic services, to water, to food. Nutrition is extremely important for early childhood, and there's vast research on this as well, that poor nutrition has long-lasting effects on individuals' abilities. So clearly, this situation is quite dramatic. Again, it's hard to quantify how much of this could affect potential growth, but clearly we're going into the direction is clear. We're going to a situation where we could have long-lasting effects. And looking at the situation in Peru compared to other countries, it looks like these effects, these negative effects, could be even more significant than in other places. Finally, the other component there is investment. Right, so investment is key for potential growth, for the potential of the economy to grow at a faster pace, and that has been affected tremendously. And as Cynthia mentioned before, we have still the community problems in the mining sector, which is one of the key sectors that attracts investment in Peru. So as we have all sorts of issues, not only just social, but also economic issues that might hurt the potential of the economy to recover and to grow as it did before this pandemic.
Do you think in terms of potential growth you said earlier that Peru had the highest potential growth in the region. Is that still the case, or is that now been jeopardized by what you just laid out?
Yeah, I think without making a quantitative assessment, but just looking at a few indicators that I showed and others, it seems that the impact on the potential impact on potential growth may be higher in Peru than in other places. So we might actually have a situation where Peru loses its spot as the outperformer there, the star of the region in terms of growth. That has been the case for the past decade. It might be the case that Peru is no longer able to grow at those levels, and it may not even be able to outperform its peers as it used to be the case.
It's a pretty bleak outlook. Cynthia, your assessment was also pretty challenging on the economic and social front. I wanted to ask you about the mining sector. Peru, as you mentioned, Peru's had weak institutions for a long time. You have communities in mining areas where they're still lacking the basic public services, and you have intense political instability at the national and the local level. So are mining companies adapting to this? Are they changing the way they navigate these problems more recently? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that and to one of the questions that came up earlier. Yes, I think before the pandemic, we've seen companies, with a learning curve, a very quick one, into how to engage with communities, how to reach out, how to try and manage conflict that's always pretty persistent. In the absence of a state that does what a state is supposed to do, as I said. I mean, there are so many demands and needs. Most large-scale mining in Peru takes place in very remote areas with weak public services, with low education levels, with high levels of poverty. And despite the tax revenues that are there, the public authorities don't usually do what one would expect them to do with that kind of revenue and reach, and the companies are often called upon to be everything. Adding to that, some of the companies actually are, they own the town, they own the water, they provide the services, they fund the schools, so they really are the authority in the region, and that's really challenging, especially challenging now when they're facing, huge cutbacks in terms of income and staffing and all the challenges of mobilizing. But I wanted to also mention something. One of the questions that came up more broadly was, about poverty and about Peru being a star in growth, and it was just a year ago or so, we were still applauding Peru for being a middle-income, middle-class country, on the road to the OECD. And what we see now, what the pandemic makes clear, and we could all see it before, but there's some that still seem surprised, is that middle class was so incredibly fragile that with the pandemic, within a month or two, that middle class is practically disappearing. And we see, people being told to just stay home. But the numbers, if you look at it, I mean, we have not only the informality in terms of employment and the economy that Paulo mentioned, but we have nearly half of Peruvian homes don't have refrigerators, for example. In this middle-income country, half of people don't have refrigerators. They have to buy food. They're on a day-to-day, every couple of days because they can't preserve food. Only 4 in 10 Peruvians have bank accounts. So when the government tries to send, emergency bonus, emergency checks to people, they have to go wait in long lines, or they can't even find them. They don't have a banking account system. 70% of our transportation, 80% of housing in urban areas is informal. And what does that mean? If you look at homes, those homes that people have been asked to stay home in are incredibly overcrowded, poor services. Many don't have adequate water and sewage, as was said. So it really kind of takes apart the myth of Peru as being, a middle-class country. It was so fragile what we had gained. And particularly in the healthcare system, someone asked there why mortality was so high, because we're all being affected by COVID, but Peru is particularly affected in terms of people who don't survive it. And that's really linked to the way in which healthcare was organized or disorganized in this country. Most people did not have access to basic quality healthcare in their communities or nearby. And the hospitals and clinics were completely understaffed, unable to deal with people with this kind of emergency. So it's shocking, as Pablo says. This is a country without a safety net in many ways. And I guess the concern is, as Julio presented, in this political competition to either stay in power or to replace Vizcarra, everything suggests that it might even get worse in terms of the type of leadership that we don't have in this country.
Interesting. Also, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Chinese investment earlier. And one of the few big investments we've seen in Peru in the last few years in infrastructure is specifically the Chancay port, which is being built by the Chinese shipping company COSCO. So I was just wondering, how do the Chinese companies see the challenges of investing in Peru differently to their counterparts in other countries?
Well, unlike Chile, for example, we have entirely private mining sector. So the largest chunk of Chinese investment has been in mining and in hydrocarbons. I mean, it's over a third of our mining investment and almost all of our major hydrocarbon investments now. The successive Peruvian governments have worked very hard to attract Chinese investment in other sectors. I think some other countries in the region have done a little bit better than Peru has in diversifying. But there's been an effort to get the Chinese to invest in infrastructure. But for example, the port that you mentioned, which is a huge project, is a private project, and it's basically largely going to serve the mining industry as well. The Chinese have invested in energy, both in Peru and other countries, significantly, buying over Luz del Sur and Chagla. As Odebrecht, as the Brazilians move out, the Chinese have moved into some of the energy sectors as well. But the challenge before the pandemic was to really offer a portfolio and entice the Chinese and others to invest in other sectors. And that's still, I think, going to be the priority going forward. The US has kind of turned its back in many ways on this region for some time. And although now there's comments coming out of Washington that there's going to be promoting more US investment in the region, China still remains, for Peru, Chile, and some other countries in this region, the major player. And China, and this is something I was talking about the other day in another event, China has been very visible in terms of responding to the crisis. The Chinese response to the COVID crisis in this region has been very high profile. It's been timely, it's been significant, it's been strategic. And as we move from sort of addressing the crisis to trying to reactivate the economy while not yet addressing the health situation, there's a lot of expectation that China will accompany us as well. And we'll see if that's going to happen or not.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. There was a question for you, Julio, in the chat relating to these videos that surfaced in the last
week.
Audios, I should say.
Yeah, the audio. Sorry.
Yeah, this one is audio takes.
Yeah.
And obviously they kind of undermine or threaten Vizcarra's kind of anti-graft, anti-corruption platform, which has been so important to his popularity.
Yeah.
I do
have some thoughts.
How seriously are these? And will Vizcarra still be in office? In July to hand over to the next president?
Yeah. This is a question that Cynthia Arson asked, and happy to. So just for those who haven't really followed closely this, let me just allow me a minute or two to give you the background. the issue here is the contracts that a motivational speaker, whose name is Richard Swing, he uses Swing as his I guess his professional name, had with the Ministry of Culture, which involved probably 150,000 pesos, which is $50,000 more or less, and there wasn't clarity about why the Ministry of Culture has to spend so much money for a motivational speaker, especially during a pandemic, because many of those speeches were like this, right, via Zoom. He must be quite a speaker if he can motivate people using Zoom. I need some advice so I can teach my classes that way. And the Comptroller's office started investigating, and there has been actually some people accused in the Ministry of Culture to so that some clarification can be given about those dealings. And then it turned out that Richard Swing, this motivational speaker, had visited the presidential palace, and so the insinuation was that maybe Vizcarra knew about these contracts, because why would he meet with this guy 6 times? That's the accusation, that the book of visits in the presidential palace registers 6 visits with this guy, and the first audios that emerged was a conversation that he had with the presidency, the secretary of the presidency, discussing about the actual number of times that this guy visited the palace. So Vizcarra said, I only saw him twice. How is it that he is showing up like 6 times? And so there was a little conversation about how to manage the political fall back for this situation, right? 6 apparently was too many visits. 2 would have looked better, but that's basically the nature of this. Since then, other audios have emerged, and I read many of them, and what it shows is, first of all, high animus between the secretary of the presidency and the subsecretary of the presidency. So there was a little of a personal conflict. And so she was trying to basically reveal some of the activities within the presidential palace aimed at placing people in different places in the state, in different ministries, mostly the spouses of those who were working closely with Vizcarra. Is that corruption? Maybe. It all depends whether, most of them look to me like political appointments. So the president might have some degree of influencing other. The point is, let's assume for a minute that it was illegal. Let's assume for a minute that it was corruption. It's the kind of run-of-the-mill corruption that we see in Peru and other Latin American countries all the time. It's not the Fujimori level corruption, and it's not even the Odebrecht level corruption, where we have massive amounts of money and officials being bought so that dubious contracts can be approved, right? This is about calling a minister, calling some friends, so somebody's husband, somebody's spouse, somebody's daughter can be, employed by the state. Brazil does that all the time. I mean, Peru does it too. So in that sense, I think that was the problem, that it wasn't really a situation that would have produced massive anger in the population and should have triggered a presidential removal. It just happened to be a perfect excuse for the president of Congress, Manuel Merino, and especially for Edgar Alarcón, who is the chair of the Oversight Committee, who happened to be a very strong ally of Antauro Humala. And that was the impetus for the removal. I probably after Vizcarra ends his term, which I think he's going to end in July. I think he's going to stick around. He might investigate it. He might even find maybe some other kind of legal consequence, but this is not so far, what we know, and I'm speaking based on what I know and what has been reported, doesn't seem to be a serious case of corruption. More than usual, let me put it that way, right? Certainly here, not in the United States, I don't think people will be scandalized by a situation like that, right?
Yeah.
Trump calling a friend of his so that somebody's spouse that is working for him gets a job.
All the time.
All the time, right? I mean, that's all the time. Yeah.
So at the very least, it merits a little bit more, well, a thorough investigation, which you can't do in the space of 1 week, obviously. And in terms of where...
So exactly, and that's... No, go ahead, John, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you, so July 28th, 2021, who is going to be putting on the presidential sash? We're putting you on the spot here. And also, are they going to have the same problems that Vizcarra is having in terms of a very small presence in Congress because of the way the electoral system works?
Yeah, the second part of your question is easier to answer. And the answer is yes, they will have the main problems because of, once again, institutional design, right? So we follow a 2-round of elections only for the president, trying to imitate the French, but the French use that for both the presidency and the legislature. So at least presidents who win the election in the second round can also have a chance of having some working majority emerging from the runoff. That is not the case in Peru. The Congress is elected in just one single round, and the congressional majorities that emerge are quite reflective of the votes at that particular round of elections. But the president might be elected 4 weeks later in a runoff where the political alliances change completely, and that president does not reflect that type of political alliances that were existing 4 weeks before. That's a problem. So yeah, it is likely that we will have another case with a president that doesn't have a working majority in Congress, especially because at this moment we don't see somebody coming from a solid or established party that could actually gain a majority both in Congress and the presidency. As per your first question, I think it's all the bets are up. If I want to be adventurous, I might say that the next president is somebody who is not listed in the poll that I just showed you, right? That will not be an accident in Peru's history. Sometimes that happens. But maybe it will be somebody like that. Based on what Paulo and Cynthia said, there is a perfect combination of circumstances for somebody who's going to come and say, enough is enough of this neoliberal economic model where the state takes a back seat. We need a strong state who takes care of people because we are dying here and we are having enough economic problems. Now, who can articulate that? Logically, it would have been the Peruvian left, but the Peruvian left is so discredited that that kind of, discourse articulation is unlikely to fall into some prior leader of the Peruvian left. The problem is that that kind of articulation, which could be articulated as a social democratic appeal, can fall into the hands of somebody who ties that to a more authoritarian law and order discourse, some kind of, left on socioeconomic issues, right on law and order. And that might be the ideal candidate that could easily win the election. I don't think we have somebody like that yet, but I'm not, discounting that it might appear. I don't know.
Wouldn't Tauro fit in that description?
And Tauro will fit into that description to a certain extent with an additional layer of craziness. But sometimes, that's what we need. I mean, I'm not going to get into his additional layer of craziness, but yeah, he will certainly fit into that description with a street cred, right? The reason why he's in prison is because he had this insurrection against Toledo, who is hiding, well, no, he's in prison here in the United States because of corruption and because he wanted to change, the democratic system into some other that works for the people. And, he rose against a democratically elected president, and that's why he is in prison. So he had the street grid. And if you look at the vote, both the IEP and Apoyo Ipsos surveys, he's polling between 5%, 8%, and especially high in the rural areas and in the southern part of the country, and especially among men. Women obviously don't like him, but among men, he has a strong appeal. So he could. The only thing that is saving us is that he's in prison. But his party, the UPP, well, not his party, but the party that basically allied with him, has what, the second or the third majority in Congress right now. So things could happen between now and March that might enable him to be a candidate for the presidency. And then I'll be scared.
Sure. Cynthia, we agree is the economy is going to determine who assumes the presidency next July. It's going to be about the economy. The previous parliamentary election was more, well, there wasn't really a strong theme, but there was the anti-corruption element. But after the pandemic, is it going to be about the economy and who's offering the most to putting money in people's pockets?
I think anti-corruption and moralizing is going to continue to be really important. And Julio has a stronger stomach than I do for reading these audio tapes and this little tempest in a teapot we have going on now. But I think it's important to look at it in the context of who's trying to bring down Vizcarra, who's trying to postpone the elections, are people who represent groups that have a lot more problems on their own plate related to corruption, related to abuse of authority, etc. I mean, it's not a surprise that Alarcón that was mentioned and others who are charging Vizcarra with corruption. And I agree, it's petty clientelism at best. It's really kind of irrelevant in the context of a crisis, I think. But trying to put the ball back on Vizcarra because there's bigger fish with bigger corruption problems. And I think people are going to want, a more social message. The healthcare and the social concerns are great. A state that provides more basic services, but they're also going to want the appearance of honesty and anti-corruption crusading. And as you say, it's not clear who that would be and how much support that would have. And I guess adding to the uncertainty that's usual in Peru now is what kind of an election process we're going to have. We don't know if by April things are going to be back to normal in terms of the way you run campaigns. Probably more emphasis on the media. Who controls the media now and how it's going to end up is not clear. I think the government right now has a pretty strong influence in media, but they're not running again for elections. So, and the media is suffering as a business as well. So we don't know what the turnout is going to be like. We don't know what campaigning is going to be like. We don't know what the media situation will be like. But I think I agree with you. I think it could very well be a winner in the second round that doesn't look like anybody in that lineup. And the chances of having sort of a strong leadership coalition in the next government are slim, which is very worrisome. We can always hope that a Salvador appears, a savior appears.
I know.
Salvador said no, very clearly. But even if we had the ideal person, that's not the only issue. It's, can you put together a coalition? Can you govern? Can you work with a Congress that's obviously going to be very divided? Will the Constitutional Tribunal be serious, or will it be full of crooks as well? There's a lot of uncertainty. This is very depressing, this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be, election. If I can just add
generation. I mean, we didn't even talk about education, but the way, all schools have gone offline, a whole generation of kids are sort of being set back in education. I mean, there's a lot of things related to young people and their prospects that's also, I think, as Paulo mentioned, it's going to have longer term impact. The sooner we pull out of this, the better. which is why the rush to get certain kinds of investment up and going, because there's a lot of things here that are going to have a long-term legacy as well.
Sure, Paulo, there was a question about the paradox that you mentioned, with Peru's big stimulus package, early lockdown, but the disastrous results. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if we step back at March, early stages of the pandemic, and what was the policy prescription? I mean, what all countries in the world, around the world were doing, at least most countries, they were tightening measures of mobility, so tightening some sort of quarantine, and giving stimulus, either through fiscal or monetary or other transfers or other measures, right? Maybe Peru did a more extreme version of that, right? So maybe that was the mistake of doing too much. I mean, Cynthia touched on this on the mining sector. If you compare mining production in Peru and Chile is black and white, right? So you had mining in Peru contractions of 45%. When you look at the aggregate sector in production, as Cynthia said, they were only allowed to produce the bare minimum. And when you go to Chile, mining production was actually going up relative to the previous year. So, and Chile took a much more selective approach to quarantine measures. The numbers there on the contagion are also quite bad. But if you just look at that, say, okay, maybe the right way to do this was to do some sort of quarantine, but be more selective. We don't know. I mean, we don't have the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened in each country if those measures were implemented in a different way. And also goes back to what Cynthia said about the situation of population in Peru. You have in the US, the government can reach to all the families and send the $1,200 check, and people can stay at home doing nothing. In Peru, they have to work to eat every single day. So, and that goes back also to what happened in the labor market. And you see the spike in informality in Peru. People just have to work. They had to find a way. Even though the stimulus was quite large, the government was not able to reach all those families. So maybe that was an unfortunate combination of things in a country that has a very particular situation, a social situation, that did not allow that stimulus to really funnel through and reach all the families that needed that help. So indeed, I mean, again, it's hard to say what they could have done differently. But what we do know from the results that we had so far is that probably the strategy wasn't the best, and some adjustments should have been done. However, when you step back, looking when we were in March and April, and with all the uncertainty around it, and policymakers really not knowing exactly how to proceed, it was very hard to say, okay, this is clearly not the right strategy.
I suppose one of the positive things that this is showing the importance of saving, of Peru's policy of fiscal prudence and maintaining a rainy day fund, keeping debt levels low, and that's kind of paying off now. But it's going to use up all of its savings, and it's going to go to take on large amounts of debt next year to pay for the budget. So that's changing, but it doesn't seem to be. I mean, looking at how investors and bond prices have been reacting, that doesn't seem to be a concern for investors. Is that fair, that despite everything Peru's going to come out of this in terms of like financially and fiscally, it's going to come out of the pandemic still quite strong relative to the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Peru had a much better starting point than most others. Right, so very low levels of debt, very prudent, orthodox economic policies, high confidence among investors in those policies. So so Peru was able to harvest the fruits of all the effort from all these past years, of all the savings, of the high growth rates, and to be able to have this sort of response, a very aggressive stimulus that they were able to implement. So certainly the fact that Peru has done its homework has helped a lot. And I think it's interesting, if you look at all the rating agencies, Peru is actually one of the very few countries that was not downgraded or even had its outlook downgraded through this crisis. Even Chile, Colombia, and other countries, Mexico, are all downgraded around the region and across the EM, but Peru, no. So certainly the fact that they've done their homework has helped a lot. And even though debt levels will increase tremendously to potentially around 40% of GDP from less than 30 in just 1 or 2 years, doesn't seem to be worrying investors because when you look at peers and relative terms, Peru still looks to be in good shape.
Well, I think maybe a good note to end off. Thanks for all the questions and thanks to the speakers. I'll hand over to Maria Rosa Baquerizo.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
It's changing the subject, but not really. Given the deficiency of the government and the state in Peru and all the needs and the fact that hunger and desperation are back on the agenda in a country like Peru, I would hope that the association could disseminate among its members. There's some really good charities working. And it's quite shocking. I mean, I used to live in New York when Peru was going through the cholera crisis and when Peru was in profound crisis in the 80s, and we all raised money and goods to send to Peru. And I actually think it's time again to think about channeling charitable donations. There's a food bank, Banco de Alimentos, there's Respira Peru for oxygen. There's a lot of organizations out there, and I would just hope that the association would spread the word, because we can talk about politics and macroeconomics, but there's a lot of real desperation out there.
It's a great suggestion. Thank you. Maria Rosa.
Thank you, John. This has really been a great panel. It has been an amazing afternoon to be here and listen to all your expertise. Thank you so much for meeting with us and for sharing all your insights about this developing situation. There are definitely very challenging times ahead, and we will be meeting again. So I also would like to thank our very hardworking staff, Linda Calvet, she's our executive secretary, and also Lori Dominguez. She's our program officer and also in charge of all the logistics. If you would like to become a member of the Peruvian American Association or the Andean American, please reply to the invitation you got for today's program. And also, I would like to thank our marvelous audience and also for their for their questions. They have been wonderful questions that really enhance the program. So we will be keeping in touch with you and invite you to future meetings. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.